All right, this is Gist of the Bible, the prophecies of other prophets. Now, just to kind of preview here, when we're talking about the gist of the Bible here, we're trying to get the big picture of the scriptures. And now I'll give you the main points of the scriptures right off the bat to know where we're going here. So if we look at the number one command in all of scripture, what would that be? Love. Love is, if you put it in one word, love. So we would say love God with your heart, soul, mind, everything, strength. You love God with your entire being. The second greatest command is what? Love your neighbor as yourself. Now, that's really the gist of the Bible right there. Love God and love your neighbor. That's it. So as we're going through this, we're going to see what happens when people fail those two commands and what happens when the people obey those two commands, the blessings that come from that. So that is really, you've got it in a nutshell right there. That's the gist of it. Love God and love your neighbor. And here's what happens, that we're at the point where in history where God's people didn't really follow those commands and the results of that. So as we continue on here, let's take a look. The prophet Ahijah prophesied that the nation of Israel would be scattered or dispersed because of their sins. So when they're sinning here, they're saying we really don't love God. And often their sins also included not loving their neighbor. And because of that, now they're going to have consequences in this land that they've been given to live in. That's going to be taken away. They're going to be scattered. They're going to be dispersed to other places. Here's 1 Kings 14:15. So Yahweh will strike Israel as a reed is shaken in the water, and he will uproot Israel from this good land which he gave to their fathers. It will scatter them beyond the river, because they have made their Asherim, provoking Yahweh to anger. So he's going to uproot. Now, this is the time I do a lot of uprooting over with this little garden that we have at the service center. And the weeds that tend to grow faster than the stuff we plant to cultivate. And I'll go and it's just like, what happened? I've just uprooted that. And now if I don't get it all the way uprooted, I'm pulling off the stem and it'll grow back. And some of that I've got to dig down deep to uproot. But when we uproot something, the purpose is to get that out of there. We're not looking to transplant something like that. We're just jerking it out. So he's going to uproot Israel from this good land, which he gave their fathers. This was land they had. This was land that they were given, and it was good land, and it was a blessing for them. But he lists some of the sins. Last time we talked about the Sabbath that they ignored. And the problem was that it showed their heart that they were disobeying God in other areas of life too. And one of the problems, they didn't let the land rest. So he said the land's going to get its rest. And so you guys are going to be gone other places. So we see more of this here. They're going to be scattered beyond the river. And here's another reason listed: because they have made their Asherim, provoking Yahweh to anger. So now their sin is provoking God to anger. What is the Asherim that they're making here?
That's the Ashtaroth.
So is it part of a pagan religion? The goddess here? Yeah, related to Baal there. So it was part of pagan worship. They're making idols to help with pagan worship. You'll see other references to Asherah poles. It was a pole they would go make and go bow down to this idol and worship it. God is a jealous God. Worship him and him only. And here they're making other gods and helping, made with hands, to help facilitate the worship of something other than the one true God. That's another reason. So the making of Asherim, wooden idols, while in itself was sinful, it was also an outward sign they had rejected the law or the covenant of God. So it was just an outward sign of their hearts, rejecting God's covenant by making these wooden idols. Their rejection of the law of God also caused them not to observe the Sabbaths in the land. So if someone doesn't really love God, they tend to say, well, I'll obey this command, but not that one, because this one's good for me, and this one might inconvenience me. And I don't want to obey the laws that inconvenience me, just the ones that are good for me. But God's not that way. We serve God wholeheartedly. And part of this Asherim, these wooden idols, was to become like the nations around them. They came out of Egypt where they had many gods they worship. Now they're surrounded by other nations that worship many gods. And it might be tempting to have an idol of a god from a nation around them. Hey, let's be friendly. Let's accept some of their traditions. And part of that, even though it's against our God, hey, what's the harm in it? That would be some things I might ask. Well, Now they're saying they've disobeyed God. They're not obeying God with their entire being, heart, soul, mind, and strength. They're not doing that. So they're rejecting some of God's laws. And outwardly, it shows by making these Asherah poles, by these wooden idols. It's shown by them not keeping the Sabbaths here, by not letting the land rest. And here they're saying they're being scattered here, scattered, a winnow to fly. They're being scattered to other places. They had a good land. It was a blessing for them. God gave it to them to be a blessing. But they're not loving God and they're not loving their neighbor. And there's consequences for that. So God was winnowing them as separating the wheat from the chaff. Jeremiah the prophet prophesied of dispersions. Jeremiah 25:34. Weep and wail, you shepherds, roll in the dust, you leaders of the flock, for your time to be slaughtered has come. You will fall like the best of rams. So what would be the shepherd's job? If we were to talk just on a physical plane, a shepherd who's taking care of his sheep, what's his job? Protect them from beasts. If they're wounded, care for them, feed them, care for them, see their needs are taken care of. Water, food, protection at night, protection from beasts. If they get lost, go find them. We can kind of get that. There's probably not many that are shepherds in that sense that we see nomadic people. Years ago when I was in Romania, I saw a shepherd leading sheep in a place called Salina. It was a place where they had this big salt cave there. I didn't go into the cave, but the area was beautiful. And there was a shepherd. And he had the thickest scratched up glasses I'd ever seen. I don't know how he could see, but he did. And the sheep followed him everywhere. I don't know. It was a bunches and bunches and bunches of sheep following him around. And they stayed close to him. And he had a job to do. And it looked like he was doing a good job. Those sheep looked healthy and happy and would follow him wherever he went. Now, if we take this up, shepherds, we understand shepherds in the church. What about shepherds here for the Jewish people, the people who are supposed to be watching over Israel? What is their job? Teach them about God, spiritual food. The same elements as the shepherd for the sheep. It's the same elements on a spiritual plane here. Well, these shepherds were not doing their jobs. Sometimes a bad shepherd, he just takes advantage of the sheep. He doesn't care about them. He just cares about his own well-being and is selfish. Well, these shepherds weren't really taking care of the people. And so they're going to be punished. Weep and wail, roll in the dust, you leaders of the flock. Your time to be slaughtered has come. You'll fall like the best of rams. Sometimes people who have a leadership position think they're untouchable, think nothing's going to happen to them. But they weren't teaching their people to love God and love their neighbors either. And it was leading them astray. They should have been God's people who protected his word. Yeah, that's good.
Because, a lot of, tribes have existed and sort of gone out of, and have lost their heritage. You don't know what their religion was or anything. And, if there was some people, priests or whatever, leaders that weren't paying attention to the word, it would have disappeared. He had to get rid of those and have leaders come up that revered.
Yeah, so God needed to get rid of the leaders that didn't protect the word and teach the word and bring up leaders that revered him. And I think that goes back to this concept of winnowing the wheat from the chaff. And he's going to get rid of some of this chaff, get rid of the chaff so the wheat can grow. So that's good. So Jeremiah spoke of this as being a scattering. I will scatter them among nations, whom they nor their fathers have known. I will send the sword after them until I have consumed them. This word is only found in this passage. It refers to a dispersion here. There's this scattering. They're going to get sent out of this good land to other places they had not known. Ezekiel the prophet prophesied of the Jews being dispersed. Ezekiel 12:14. I will scatter to every wind all who are around him. His helpers and all his troops, I will draw out the sword after them, so they will know that I am Yahweh when I scatter them among the nations and spread them among the countries here. So they're being dispersed to other areas. They're going to have to live under the oversight of other people. They're going to be forced to live in ways they don't like. They're not going to have control of their own land and how they do things. They're going to have to live with other people over them who probably won't be as kind to them, who definitely won't be as kind to them as God was, and giving them the opportunity to live in their own good land and prosper. So note this carries the idea of winnowing. God separating the wheat from the chaff. He's separating the good from the bad. This is going to be a time of sifting out here of the people who obey and those who don't obey God. Ezekiel again prophesied of the dispersion of the children of Israel. Ezekiel 22. Can your heart stand, or can your hands be strong in the days that I will act against you? I, Yahweh, have spoken and will act. I will scatter you among the nations, and I will disperse you through the lands, and I will put an end to your uncleanliness from you. You will profane yourself in the sight of the nations, and you will know that I am Yahweh. So here, there's this vision here, this prophecy of a scattering. You're going to be sent places you won't want to go. Now, this figure may be also a figure of water overflowing to make the land produce. Here is coming up. We're going to see here. He's going to be this leavening influence of the good people, the good Jews, to help bring the nation back with this remnant of faithful people that will come back and lead once again. But there's a sifting going on right now because they chose not to love God with their entire being. And often in these pagan religions, they don't love their neighbor. They use their neighbors and take advantage of them. Well, the dispersion of the children of Israel has been accomplished in the days of Esther. Esther 3:8, you have despised my holy things and desecrated my Sabbaths. So this is one of the reasons they had been dispersed to other places. Now it's despised my holy things. So that's very interesting here that they had despised the holy things. They looked down on things that were holy and desecrated my Sabbaths. Again, they weren't obeying God wholeheartedly. And the things that were holy, things that should have been separated out and held in high esteem, were then just looked upon as common. They did not respect God. These dispersed people could return to God and be restored to his favor. We find that in Nehemiah 1:8. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. So he's saying, if you look back, remember Moses talked about this. He told you this would happen, and now it has happened. So what do we do now? Well, the Bible also gives them instructions on what to do. This was a promise to each individual Jew who would seek God with all his heart, repent, and turn back to God. In the New Testament, the Jews that lived out Palestine were called the Jews of dispersion. Now we're skipping ahead to John chapter 7, verse 35. When the Jews said to one another, where does this man intend to go that we will not find him? Is he intending to go to the dispersion among the Greeks and teach the Greeks? So even in Jesus' day, there were people that were dispersed. They were scattered, and they refer to them as those, the dispersion here, that they lived among other people, the Greeks people here. Often Greek is used interchangeably with Gentile, people that weren't Jew. And even in the New Testament, the Jews that lived out in Palestine were called Jews of dispersion. Here's James 1:1. James, a slave of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes who are in the dispersion, greetings. So even in New Testament times, there were people that were still known as Jewish people that were been scattered and lived in other areas. And we know that even in the time at AD 70, the temple was destroyed, and Jewish people had to leave that area. We know there were rulers that said you have to leave this area, and they would be scattered and went to other places. The Greek word here is diaspora, and it's a scattering, a dispersion. Israel's dispersed among foreign nations. The synagogues of the Jews were a tool through which the gospel was spread, and this may be one tool through which the faithful Jews influenced the lands in which they lived. For those who didn't go back, if they had enough people there, if they had 10 men, they could establish a synagogue. And that would be a light to that community, that they could learn about the scriptures and learn about God and the lands that they had been scattered to. This also seems to be the usage of this term in 1 Peter 1, verses 1 and 2. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ to God's elect, exiles scattered throughout the provinces of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, Bithynia, who have been chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father through the sanctifying work of the Spirit to be obedient to Jesus Christ and sprinkled with his blood. Grace and peace be yours in abundance. Now, this also seems to be the usage of the term in 1 Peter. Now, these provinces are all in what's now the country of Turkey that he's referring to. The Jews had been dispersed during the Babylonian period, the Persian period, and the Macedonian Empire. So they had been scattered among many places. Some did get to return, though, but even as they're scattered, if they will turn to him, they can still be a light to the community and God can still bless them. So why did God disperse the children of Israel among those nations? Well, there had to be a reason. Remember, we talked about the gist of the Bible is to love God with your entire being, heart, soul, mind, and strength. The other is to love your neighbor as yourself. Why were they dispersed? Well, because they failed at those things. God took away the land that they were living in. Said, I'm sending you other places. How do you do that? Well, enemies came in. You had Babylon with Nebuchadnezzar came in very strong and powerful. His people took over the lands there in Judah. Before that, it was the Assyrian nation that was strong and powerful that took over and took people away. And so we see this happening where God used other nations to help to do his bidding here. Well, they were dispersed to give their own testimony concerning their own abominations. Now, this is interesting in Ezekiel 12. Here's the reason. And I will scatter to every wind all who are around him, his helpers and all his troops, and I will draw out a sword after them, so they will know that I am Yahweh when I scatter them among the nations and spread them among the countries. But I will spare a few of them from the sword, famine, and pestilence, that they may recount all their abominations among the nations where they go, and may know that I am Yahweh. Now, as we read through this, we see more of what God did to them. He mentions here about famine. Well, famine can be caused by many things. It could be a lack of rain. Could be the enemy comes in. Could be bugs come and eat your crops. This was one of the tools that he used here. Sword, that'd be enemies coming in. Pestilence, there goes the critters that come in. He says when they're carried off, they can recount these things to those nations, says, here's what happened and here's why we got taken over and here's why we're in a land that's not ours. We sinned against God. That was their testimony as they went. John?
Like Alcoholics Anonymous.
Like Alcoholics Anonymous, okay?
Sometimes the best people to tell about the evils of alcoholism are former alcoholics.
So John says sometimes the best people to talk about the evils of alcoholism are former alcoholics, recovering alcoholics. That's a very good point. And these would be people who had seen the negative aspects of not loving God and loving their neighbor. And here's what happened. So they could warn others. This is what happened to us. Don't do that. Don't be like us in this instance here. That's a good observation. They had shed innocent blood and worshipped idols. This was another one of their punishments here. Then the word of Yahweh came to me saying, Son of man, when the house of Israel was living in their own land, they defiled it by their ways and their deeds. Okay, so they defiled the land. Doing what here? Their way before me was like the uncleanliness of a woman in her impurity. Therefore, I poured out my wrath on them for the blood which they had shed on the land, because they had defiled it with their idols. Also, I scattered them among nations, and they were dispersed to the lands according to their ways and their deeds. I judged them. He's saying, my judgment is righteous here. I'm judging them because of how they behaved. And now, not only are they not loving God with their entire being, they're not just neglecting to love God wholeheartedly, they're neglecting to love their neighbor, their closest neighbor in here. It says they had shed the blood they had shed on their land and defiled it with their idols. Often idol worship included human sacrifice, something that God detested that they do, and they were doing on the land that he gave them. And so it was abhorrent to God. And so God judged them from what they did. The first reason for God pouring out his wrath was for the blood which they had poured out on the land. So I poured out my wrath on them because they had shed blood in the land and because they had defiled it with their idols. So that's one reason. The second reason for God pouring out his wrath was they had defiled it, the land, with their idols. It's evident that idolatry entailed all sorts of sinful activities. What's wrong with having another God? What's wrong with having God and another idol? Why can't we have two? If we can have two, why not have three? Why not have four? What's wrong with serving these other gods? And they would try to isolate God. Our God is the God of this area. Their God is their God of this area. We need to have both. We need to line up as many idols as we can so we can be fully protected. You just can't depend on one. That would be their thinking there. But in their worship of these idols, it entailed sinful activities that were not loving their neighbor. There were many sinful activities that this included. So idol worship was sin, and it led to more sin. Amos revealed that both Judah and Israel had sinned. Amos 2:4. This is what the Lord says: for 3 sins of Judah, even 4, I will not relent, because they have rejected the law of the Lord, have not kept his decrees, because they have been led astray by false gods, the gods their ancestors followed. Interesting. I will send fire on Judah that will consume the fortress of Jerusalem. This is what the Lord says: for 3 sins of Israel, even 4, I will not relent. They sell the innocent for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. They trample on the heads of the poor as on the dust of the ground. They deny justice to the oppressed. Father and son use the same girl and so profane my holy name. They lie down beside every altar on garments taken in pledge, and the house of their God they drink wine as taken as fines. So here is a lot of examples of how they did not love their neighbor. Did you catch that about selling the needy for a pair of sandals? He's got so little value. Just give me a pair of sandals. You can have this guy. Trample on the heads of the poor. A coat taken in pledge. Yeah, it's not mine. I'll use it how I want. I'm going to lay this down in the dirt and lay on it. I got it until he can pay me back. I can do what I want with it. Misusing people. Well, again, the gist of the Bible: love God and love your neighbor. And here's how they're failing at this so miserably here, and what they're doing. So Amos revealed that both Judah and Israel had sinned. Amos pronounced judgment on Judah, and Amos 2, 4, and 5, and then Amos pronounced judgment on Israel in verses 6 through 8. They committed a number of sins that were listed on there, and how they really took advantage of the poor and mistreated other people. Here's Amos 9, verse 4. Though they are driven into exile by their enemies, there I will command the sword to slay them. I will keep my eye on them for harm and not for good. The Lord Almighty, he touches the earth and it melts, and all who live in it mourn. The whole land rises like the Nile and sinks like the river of Egypt. He builds his lofty place and the heavens and sets its foundations on the earth. He calls for the waters of the sea and pours them out over the face of the land. The Lord is his name. Yes.
So the sinful, like, for example, in Russia, they had many pogroms, which was, persecution of the Jews, to drive them out, steal their land. And then also, the Jews were expelled from Rome, Priscilla and Aquila.
Yes, Priscilla and Aquila were expelled from Rome.
At some point, they were expelled from Spain.
Mm-hmm.
So it was pretty widespread, this persecution.
Yeah, persecution was widespread. Here we see God's involvement in some of this because of their own sins, that he's judging them for some of this. Now, some of this, like as you talk to the New Testament reference, it could be good people, Christians, that face the consequences from others, and they were expelled, but they would take the gospel with them and trust God. And I might have been converted after them. Yeah, that's very true. Very true. Yeah, so the persecution even in current day could be amping up. Yeah, you do see groups of people that mistreat others, and as Christians, we're taught not to mistreat them. We're still taught to love our neighbor. Well, here we're focusing on the sins that they had committed here. They made an ephah, a volume measurement, small, sold less than an EPA, made their basket smaller than an EPA, but claimed it was an EPA, and increased their profit. So this is one of the things they did to cheat others. What if you went to go get a bushel of something, but you didn't get a bushel? You got less than that. Oh, but it's a bushel. You know, we actually have legal things. You go to the gas pump. This has been tested by weights and measurements. If you pay for a gallon, you get a gallon. Why do we have such a thing? Because so many people were cheated and not getting a gallon of gas that they paid for. It's got to be within a couple pennies. Yeah, it's got to be. But often, they put programs in certain things where you get 5 gallons of gas and it'll pump. You'll get your gallon, and it'll slow down, and the meter still keeps the same speed, but the gas pumps in slower till you get around that 5-gallon mark, so it measures right. So they had to change even how they measured the amount of gas, so it wasn't 5-gallon, 10-gallon. They have to make this can is 7.3 gallons, and then they would measure an odd number and detect the cheating going on. But here was cheating food. You're not going to get the amount of food you think you're getting. You're not getting paid. You're not getting what you're paying for. Rachel told me one of the things that she was a little disappointed in Romania is that the coffee wasn't as good as she used to. Of course, she works at Starbucks. And when you get you a cup of coffee, it's only like there's regular and large. Regular is 8 ounces, large is 10. It's like they don't even fill up the 10-ounce cup all the way. It's like, well, yeah, they do things differently over there. It's okay.
If you see a price on the shelf, it's not the price that they charge the rate.
Okay, so John says one store is getting sued because the shelf might have a certain price, but when you get to the register, it might not be that price. That's a good point. I know when I'm shopping with Joanna, I like to stand where it's showing me how much something costs. I want to see it. I'm not bagging up stuff. I want to see it because I've run into that with places too. It's like, nope, that's not right. Stop. And the person checking doesn't know. They're just going beep, 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 beep. They don't go, but I'm like, no, that ain't right. Stop right there. But people would cheat others. Do you love your neighbor if you're cheating them, not giving them the full product? That's not loving your neighbor. No. And this is some of the things that had infiltrated their society was business practices to cheat their neighbor. And so they would make it look like they were getting so much, but they weren't. They would change the basket. They had their balances that were not accurate. And so they would have scales and it wouldn't be accurate on there. They would make it where if you're buying it, they'd make it where they would get more. And if they were selling, they would put a different weight so they could give away less. That's where we get the term where they got cheated coming and going. They would do that. Yes, Alan. Their focus was on their self and self gain. We call that selfishness.
That's just the opposite of
it is the opposite, and it's easy to justify it. Well, everybody's doing it. I have to keep up with them, or I'm going to lose. Everybody does it this way. But no, then they sold refuse of the wheat. Their wheat was mixed with chaff. So that was being their food was not finally sorted out. Then you would get a product that was not very good. Yes, Mariah. Yeah, the waiter thing's the law. Yeah, they would tithe on their mint and cumin, their spices, little things, but would neglect justice and weightier matters of the law. He's saying keep the weightier matters of the law. You can still keep the finer points, but they're neglecting the major points and saying we're keeping the fine.
Look at that. So they cheated, give more to the church.
Well, they didn't do that either, but yeah.
Some of these people will be going, well, I want to make a little bit more, but now I can give more.
There was and there was
not acceptable.
No, there was a doctor that was charged for that who made out that he was a Christian and he was helping cancer patients, and he would get their chemotherapy and water it down so he could give them a lower dose and then sell that twice because it was diluted. And then it was to give, for good causes was his justification for that. but others were like, how come this isn't working like we thought it would? Well, you're not getting the full dose. So yeah, people will justify their cheating and even say, well, it's for a good cause, so therefore it's okay. But no, that's not right. But you mentioned about justifying there. Well, often these people, when it came to giving to the Lord, and they would tie their animals and things, they would bring in their blind animals and their lame animals. And the prophet said, you wouldn't even do that to your governors over there, but you'll do that for me. So that was a selfishness. John?
Provided bypass. But the patients didn't need it. But, you know, they got so much money for each bypass.
Uh-huh.
And so they were.
So they would sell unnecessary services to beef their profits. Yeah, people do that too. Sell you something you don't need. That's another way. So you can see this is kind of some of the thinking, and we have that thinking even modern days, but this is some of the things they were condemned on. Paul set this forth in 1 Corinthians 10:5. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. He's talking about the folks that were going into the promised land and the wandering there. Now, these things occurred as an example to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Do not be idolaters as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. They were just living it up, not thinking about God and his ways. So he says an example, don't be like them. 1 Corinthians 10:5-11 here, continues verse 8. We should not commit sexual immorality as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 of them died. We should not test Christ as some of them did and were killed by snakes, and do not grumble as some of them did and were killed by destroying angel. These things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the culmination of the ages has come. Sexual immorality, fornication there is the word that's being described here. So they committed these things. This was their practice and their way of life, and thought that they could just keep living that way and everything would be fine, and it wasn't. So the point here, these things happen as examples to us. We can look and see the mistakes they made, how they quit serving God. They quit loving God as they should. And when they quit loving God as they should, they clearly quit loving their neighbor as they should. They cheated them in business practices. They took advantage of them. The poor, oh, just take that guy and trade him for there's some traders, just trade him for, you need a new pair of shoes, trade him for some old shoes and get that guy out of here. Trample the heads of the poor. They can't persecute you. They have no way to prosecute you. Just do what you want to them, mistreat them. So they did not help the ones that needed the most help. They were taking advantage of the widows and the orphans, the poor and the needy. They were cheating them in business trade. They were very selfish. Verse 11 here, these were written as examples for us. So we look at these things and learn, don't be like them. They were dispersed to consume the filthiness among them. Ezekiel 22:15. I will disperse you among the nations and scatter you through the countries, and I will put an end to your uncleanliness. When you have been defiled in the eyes of the Lord of the nations, you will know that I am the Lord. So they've been defiled in the eyes of the nations. And so they're looking, wow, how did your God let all this happen to you? Why are you getting punished this way? And they'd say, well, here's what happened. We cheated people. We took advantage of the poor. We were taking the poor and trading them for a pair of shoes because I need a new pair of shoes. And they could list all these things and say, we messed up. This is why we're living in this way. And the other nations, they go, wow. Wow. Ezekiel 22, they would profane in themselves and bring shame that led to repentance. Their filthiness would be consumed. They would also be profane in the sight of nations, the Gentiles, and they would come to know Jehovah. They would come to know God. Here's Ezekiel 12:14. I will scatter to the winds all those around him, his staff and all his troops, and I will pursue them with drawn sword. They will know that I am the Lord when I disperse them among the nations and scatter them through the countries. The inhabited towns will be laid waste, and the land will be desolate. Then you will know that I am the Lord. See, they could have known the Lord through all the blessings that he had given them, through the power that he led them out of Egypt. They should have known the Lord through all those great things, but they forgot about him. They quit loving him. They quit loving their neighbor. And now they're dealing with the consequences of those decisions. It says here, in order that they might come to know God. That expression, know God, is a very important expression there. And it's found in a number of passages in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. Under the old law, the Jewish children had to be taught how to know God. They were born into this covenant. They would be circumcised. The males would be circumcised. They were born into this covenant. And as a Jew, they would be slowly taught. Now, hey, you're a Jew, you need to obey God in these things. But in the Christian age, it's totally reversed. It's flipped the other way. We teach people about God, and then they choose to become Christians. So things have changed here. And if we want to know about that new covenant, it's found in Jeremiah 31:31 and following, and it's also repeated in the book of Hebrews. So we understand the new covenant that we live under was foretold even in the Old Testament, that it's going to be a covenant not like the one they're used to. So Christianity does have some differences here, but the principles we've studied remain the same. Love God with your entire being and love your neighbor as yourself. Don't be selfish. Don't take advantage of them because you're in a higher position. Don't take advantage of the poor, but instead help them. Don't take advantage of the needy and mistreat them. When it comes to business practices, we would say, give someone a day's work for a day's pay was a saying we would give them. That we'd say in teaching our young people as they go out into work to be good employees. If they're working for someone else, to work hard. We say work as if you're working for the Lord. So that should be a Christian trait that people see in us, that we work hard, we're good workers, we're honest workers, we do our best, and we do our best not to cheat anybody. Maybe you're in a business selling something. You want to give a good product and an honest product, and give honest testimony about that we're selling. These are some elements that have continued, some principles that continue throughout the ages for us as we strive to love God and love our neighbor. That's included in our business practices and how we do business with others. I was thinking on my mechanic trade, and Alan did a lot of mechanic work. And when I was working in the shop, and back then there was a lot of V8 engines. And a tune-up, usually it included many things, but it always included changing the spark plugs. Back then, spark plugs needed changed a lot more often than they do now. Now we can sometimes run spark plugs 100,000 miles without worrying about them. But back then, that was not the case. You had to change them much more frequently, maybe even yearly. And if the car wasn't running right, even more often, if it was burning oil or running rich, it would foul out those spark plugs. But as those cars came in, there tended to be times where there would be 7 spark plugs that were reasonably easy to get to. But there would be number 8 that was buried under all kinds of junk that would take you just as much time to change that one plug as it took the other 7. And there'd be that temptation, if the engine was running pretty good and if that cylinder wasn't misfiring and it was working okay, there'd be that temptation, just leave number 8. No one's going to know the difference until they change the plugs again, and it'll probably last a while. So don't worry about number 8. But if you're being honest in business, you do the whole job and you do it right. And you don't cheat, folks. You do an honest day's work for honest day's pay. And so don't take shortcuts, but be honest in your trade, whatever it may be. That'll conclude our lesson today. Thank you all for being here today.